Welcome to another podcast of the Riffle series. The Riffle podcast series brought to you by 10 Leaves. So imagine an industry generating somewhere between 110 billion and up to 281 billion US dollars a year.
Which is just a staggering amount of money, honestly.
Right. It's literally larger than the GDP of entire nations.
Yeah.
But instead of, producing software, manufacturing cars, this specific industry is quietly funding global ecological destruction.
Yeah, and doing it right under our noses.
Exactly. And here's the kicker for you listening today. This enterprise is actively washing its illicit profits, utilizing the exact same global banks, logistics companies, and standard trade networks that you and I interact with every single day.
It's not some shadowy underground economy, it's the mainstream one.
Yep. So today, our mission is to unpack a highly revealing strategic analysis from the UAE Financial Intelligence Unit. This report covers the period from 2019 to 2025, and it takes a really hard look at environmental crime typologies and money laundering risks. I promise you there's going to be a huge aha moment here about how our systems are being misused. Okay, let's unpack this.
It really is a phenomenal piece of analysis, I have to say. To truly grasp the gravity of what we are talking about today, we have to start by completely reframing how we think about environmental damage.
Right, getting away from the usual stereotypes.
Exactly. We are not talking about, isolated incidents of pollution or a lone poacher in a remote savanna. We are talking about highly organized transnational activities. They exploit natural resources purely for financial gain with zero regard for biodiversity.
And it touches almost every single corner of the globe. The scale outlined in this report is just mind-boggling. I mean, it notes that environmental crime affects roughly 4,000 species across 162 different countries.
So physical volume alone is hard to wrap your head around.
It really is. If you just look at the period between 2015 and 2021, law enforcement bodies worldwide confiscated over 13 million individual illicit items.
Wow.
Yeah, that equates to roughly 16,000 tons of illicit wildlife products physically moving across borders. And locally, the UAE's 2024 National Risk Assessment classifies this exact activity as a medium-risk predicate offense for money laundering.
Which is a crucial legal classification.
Let's define that really quick for the listener.
So for those unfamiliar with the terminology, a predicate offense simply means it is the underlying criminal activity, the original sin, so to speak. It's the crime that generates the dirty money needing to be laundered in the first place.
So the crime produces the cash, and the laundering washes it.
You got it. But here is the massive disconnect we need to explore today. Despite that official medium risk rating, there is a gaping hole in how the financial sector actually handles this reality on a day-to-day operational basis.
Yeah, let's dive right into that gap, because the survey data from the FIU report highlights a fascinating contradiction. They surveyed 92 financial institutions, so that's 48 traditional banks and 44 money service businesses.
A good sample size.
Right. Now, a solid majority, 63% of these institutions explicitly say, yes, we view environmental crime as a predicate offense. They officially acknowledge it's a crime on their books.
But the actual detection rates are a different story.
Completely. Only 10% of them have actually identified and reported related suspicious transactions. And even worse, most of their reports, I think around 30%, are triggered reactively by what's called adverse media.
Meaning they see it on the news first.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They only launch an investigation after they read about a customer being busted for wildlife trafficking in the newspaper, rather than proactively catching the financial anomalies through their own internal monitoring.
Right, and if you are an institution waiting for a journalist to expose a massive smuggling ring before you bother to check your own ledgers, you are entirely too late.
The damage is done.
Yeah, the money has already moved, the accounts are emptied, and the environmental destruction on the ground is permanent.
I have to push back on this, though. If the high-end estimate is $281 billion annually, I mean, going back to my earlier point, that is the GDP of an entire country.
It is massive.
If the financial footprint of this crime is the size of a nation, how in the world are major technologically advanced banks missing it? Is it willful ignorance from the banking sector, or are the criminals just that incredibly good at hiding it?
What's fascinating here is that it's usually not willful ignorance on the part of the banks. It is fundamentally a lack of a structural framework.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, according to that same survey in the report, 72% of these financial institutions cite a limited understanding of the actual typologies, meaning they simply do not understand the specific ways these crimes are committed and funded.
So they don't even know what to look for.
Exactly. On top of that, 54% admit they lack clear risk indicators to program into their systems. You really have to remember how modern anti-money laundering systems were built over the last few decades.
They were built for drugs and terrorism, right?
Yes, exactly. They are highly calibrated to look for traditional, well-established red flags. Terrorism financing, drug cartels, human trafficking. The algorithms and the compliance officers are actively hunting for those specific data patterns.
So it's not that they can't see the data.
No, they simply aren't calibrated to see environmental degradation as a financial crime. It's a massive blind spot.
So it's like they're looking through a high-powered microscope, but they have the entirely wrong slide loaded into it.
That is a great way to put it.
They are looking for the financial fingerprint of a cocaine shipment, so the financial fingerprint of a smuggled ton of rare timber just goes completely unnoticed.
Precisely. If you don't know what the financial footprint of that smuggled timber looks like, you aren't going to flag the transaction, even if the invoice passes right across your desk.
Well, if banks are missing 90% of these transactions, what exactly are they blind to? To figure out how the money is hiding, we first have to understand what physical goods these networks are actually moving on the ground.
We have to look at the physical crimes first.
Right. Let's step out of the bank vault for a second. The report categorizes the bulk of this activity into three primary typologies. Let's call them the big three.
And these big three make up the absolute lion's share of the suspicious transaction reports that the FIU analyzed. The most prevalent by far, making up 44% of the reports, is the illegal wildlife trade, or IWT.
This one is driven by some very specific, highly lucrative global markets. We are talking about luxury fashion, traditional medicine, and the seemingly insatiable demand for exotic pets.
The pet trade is huge.
It is. The report specifically calls out the smuggling of tortoises, falcons, Spix's macaws, orangutans, and animal parts like gallbladders and skins. It is incredibly heartbreaking from an ecological standpoint.
Oh, absolutely devastating.
But strictly financially speaking, it is a booming business.
It is remarkably lucrative. Now, the UAE has very strict frameworks in place, like Federal Law Num 22 of 2016, which heavily restricts the ownership of dangerous and exotic animals purely to authorized entities.
Places like zoos, breeding centers, research facilities.
Exactly. But transnational criminal groups constantly exploit the global demand to bypass those laws.
So how does that transaction actually work? Because I imagine someone buying a smuggled Spix's macaw doesn't just wire funds to a poacher with rare bird in the memo line.
Definitely not.
So how do they move the money for something that is so clearly illegal?
They rely heavily on layered third-party payments. Let's walk through a hypothetical transaction. The end buyer might set up a shell company, let's call it an agricultural consulting firm.
Okay, sounds very boring and standard.
Right, that's the point. They send a massive payment to a supplier in another country, but they invoice it completely falsely as a purchase for specialized aviary equipment or veterinary supplies. That money is then layered. It is bounced through 3 different jurisdictions, maybe converted into different currencies, before it finally lands in the account of the actual wildlife trafficker.
Wow.
So the physical animal is moving along one highly concealed smuggling route, while the money is taking an entirely different, heavily sanitized journey through the legitimate global banking system.
And if you are the bank compliance officer looking at that wire transfer, all you see is an agricultural firm paying for veterinary supplies. It looks perfectly mundane.
It perfectly illustrates the blind spot.
Okay, moving to the second of the big three, which accounts for 26% of the analyzed reports. The illicit trade of smuggled oil.
This is a major one.
Yeah, this specific crime was frequently flagged by the Federal Authority for Identity, Citizenship, Customs, and Port Security. And the environmental hazard here isn't just the theft of the resource.
No, it's the sheer destruction caused by moving it around illegally.
Right. Improper handling and unregulated storage of this smuggled oil leads to massive soil and groundwater contamination, not to mention severe fire risks.
The mechanism the syndicates use here is highly sophisticated. These networks utilize massive webs of shell companies to transport the oil from one exporter to another.
And they lie about where it came from, right?
Systematically. They misrepresent the origin of the oil on customs documents to bypass international sanctions or environmental regulations. And financially, the way they secure the funds is by using something called pool exports to collateralize letters of credit.
Let's pause and break that down because a letter of credit is a foundational tool in global trade finance. It's essentially a bank guaranteeing that a buyer's payment to a seller will be received on time and for the correct amount.
It mitigates risk for both parties.
Right. So how does a criminal network use pool exports to manipulate such a standard banking instrument?
By using a strategy of laundering by dilution. Let's say you have a sanctioned, illicit, or stolen batch of oil. If you try to secure a letter of credit to sell that specific batch directly, the bank's compliance software will instantly flag the origin and reject the transaction.
Because it's obviously dirty.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, and here's the trick, if you pool that illicit oil with a massive legitimate shipment of oil from multiple legal sources, creating a pool export,
Oh, I see where this is going.
it becomes incredibly difficult, almost impossible, for a bank to trace the exact origin of every single drop in that tanker. The large volume of legitimate oil provides the required collateral and all the clean paperwork needed for the bank to confidently issue the letter of credit.
That is wild.
They effectively wash the stolen oil's proceeds in plain sight by diluting it into the legal supply chain.
That is just brilliant in the most malicious way possible.
Yeah.
Laundering by dilution.
Okay, so oil operates through this complex blending process, but what about assets that don't necessarily need bank-issued letters of credit to hold their value?
You're talking about physical assets.
Yeah. That brings us to the third major typology, sitting at 18% of the reports, illegal mining. We are talking about the extraction of precious metals and stones without permits, very often taking place in highly volatile conflict zones. How does a warlord wash a rough diamond? Well, this typology has incredibly deep historical ties to money laundering and the financing of armed conflict. Gold and diamonds extracted from unregulated sources are essentially used as a proxy currency.
To bypass banks entirely.
Precisely. They use it to move illicit wealth seamlessly around the globe, totally outside the banking system.
I was actually thinking about this exact concept when reading through your notes on the report. It's almost like smuggled gold and diamonds act as a heavy physical cryptocurrency for these syndicates.
That is a fascinating way to look at it.
It just acts as an untraceable store of immense value that bypasses traditional ledgers entirely if they want it to.
I think that is the perfect analogy, a heavy physical cryptocurrency. That captures exactly why these specific commodities are chosen by criminal networks. They possess extremely high value relative to their physical size, making them very easy to smuggle across borders.
Easy to hide in a suitcase or a shipping container.
Right. But more importantly, once you melt down a bar of illicit conflict-mined gold and mix it with a bar of legally mined gold in a refinery, it is scientifically impossible to tell them apart.
The ultimate laundering by dilution again?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It permanently obscures the trail of the illicit wealth. That is why the FIU report notes that Missing Kimberley Process Certification Scheme, or KPCS documentation, is such a critical, non-negotiable red flag.
Let's define that for the listener really quick. What exactly is the Kimberley process?
The KPCS is an international, multi-state certification scheme specifically designed to prevent conflict diamonds, often called blood diamonds, from entering the legitimate mainstream rough diamond trade.
So it's basically a passport for a diamond.
Exactly. Every legitimate shipment of rough diamonds must cross a border with a valid KPCS certificate. If a massive diamond shipment is missing that specific paperwork, or there are unexplainable breaches in gold sourcing documentation, it is a screaming indicator of illegal mining and money laundering.
Now, the report also touches on a few other typologies that are absolutely worth noting before we move on. There is illegal logging and forestry crime, which is driven by massive global timber demand and relies almost exclusively on falsified customs documentation.
A huge problem in certain regions.
Yeah. There's fisheries crime, which includes unauthorized fishing in protected waters or blatantly ignoring breeding season restrictions. And then there is waste trafficking, which I found particularly insidious.
That one is really troubling.
It involves misclassifying highly hazardous materials, things like toxic electronic components or chemical waste, just to cheaply dump them in vulnerable jurisdictions that have weak environmental controls.
And the common thread linking all of these physical crimes is commingling. They all rely on mixing legal and illegal goods together and exploiting the sheer overwhelming complexity of international trade routes to hide the illicit origins.
Well, knowing exactly what physical goods are being stolen and moved, it's time to logically shift our focus to the mechanics of how these massive proceeds are washed.
The actual laundering playbook.
Right. The UAE is a major global logistics, shipping, and financial hub. That connectivity is fantastic for legitimate international business, but it naturally makes it an attractive transit point for these transnational networks. What does the actual playbook look like?
The report outlines several recurring, highly effective methods. First, as we touched on earlier, is the widespread use of shell and front companies. Criminals will legally establish corporate entities with very vague, incredibly broad trade licenses.
Usually registered as consultancy firms, right?
Yes, or general trading enterprises.
Right.
This vague classification allows them to mask illicit wildlife or mineral transactions behind generic, nondescript invoices.
And then there is trade-based money laundering, or TBML. Now, I think a lot of people hear the phrase trade-based money laundering and their eyes glaze over a bit because it sounds like a very dry, dense accounting term.
It does sound like a textbook definition.
It does, but the report mentions over-invoicing and under-invoicing. Walk us through that mechanism. If I am a criminal, how exactly does under-invoicing actually transfer my illicit wealth across the world?
It is actually a very elegant mechanism once you break it down. Think of it this way. If I owe you $2 million in dirty money, I don't just hand you a briefcase full of cash.
Too risky.
Way too risky. And I certainly don't wire the funds directly to your bank account where it will be flagged. Instead, I sell you a massive shipping container of legally sourced timber that is genuinely worth $4 million on the open market.
Okay, I follow you so far.
But on the official customs and banking invoice, I only charge you $2 million.
Wait, really? So you just give me a massive discount on paper?
Exactly. You receive the container, you sell the timber to a legitimate buyer for its true market value of $4 million, and you pocket the $2 million difference.
Wow.
The money has officially been transferred to you, but it flew completely under the radar because the bank merely processed what looked like a standard legal invoice for discounted timber.
That is incredible. The trait itself is the mechanism of transfer. And they pair this with multi-jurisdictional layering, right? Bouncing the money through several different countries to intentionally break the paper trail from the source country to the final destination.
Exactly. And they heavily utilize third-party intermediaries. They'll use family members, professional facilitators, or entirely unrelated third-party corporate accounts to move the funds so the central criminals never actually touch the money directly.
Okay. Looking at the sectors most vulnerable to all of this, it makes perfect sense that banks take the biggest hit. The report states they account for about 32% of the vulnerability, which is logical because they are the ultimate gatekeepers of international wire transfers.
They are the main artery.
But what fascinated me is that logistics and shipping are right behind them at 22%. Why is the logistics sector so exposed?
Because the criminals physically need the cargo ships, the freight forwarders, and the local couriers just as much as they need the bank's wire transfers. You cannot smuggle 16,000 tons of wildlife products over Wi-Fi.
Huh. Right, that makes total sense.
The physical supply chain is just as critical to the crime as the financial one. Following that, the energy sector sits at 20%, heavily linked to that complex oil smuggling typology we discussed. And the trading sector, including import and export businesses, makes up the remaining 15%.
This brings us to the actual risk indicators, the red flags. The FIU has broken these down into behavioral and custom-specific flags. Behaviorally, a bank might see a newly established company, registered just weeks ago with practically no staff, suddenly handling massive cross-border transaction volumes.
A classic red flag.
Yeah. Or you look at a customer's profile and they are frequently making travel and hotel bookings in remote areas globally known for wildlife poaching or trophy hunting, yet their stated profession is running a domestic tech startup.
It makes absolutely no sense.
None at all.
And you see similar transactional indicators. For example, an account receiving high volumes of funds from multiple unrelated sources in jurisdictions historically known for environmental resource exploitation.
Or outgoing payments to weird places, right?
Yeah, outgoing payments being sent to zoos, private animal breeders, or wildlife traders from individuals or companies that have absolutely zero clear business link to the animal care industry.
Think about the last time you traveled internationally and had to fill out a customs declaration form before leaving the airport. You write down exactly what you bought, maybe some souvenirs or electronics.
Very straightforward.
Now imagine doing that, but you are a massive corporate entity and you are declaring critically endangered wildlife parts as decorative handicrafts or leather goods.
It happens every day.
The report points out that the level of misdeclaration on shipping containers is almost comical. Criminals are hiding illicit items within hollowed-out furniture, stuffed inside raw timber shipments, or, and this is the one that really got me, packed inside frozen food containers.
Oh yeah, frozen food is a major vector.
I mean, think about the absurdity of this. Here's where it gets really interesting. If I'm running a boutique management consultancy firm, why on earth am I suddenly shipping tons of frozen food or decorative handicrafts from a high-risk mining jurisdiction?
It sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud.
Right. Why don't these blatant, screaming contradictions immediately freeze a bank account?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to realize the sheer volume and velocity of global commerce. It's not just looking for a needle in a haystack. It's looking for a needle hidden in a stack of identical needles.
That's a good point.
In a massive global trade hub, millions of shipping containers are physically moving, and billions of dollars are flowing digitally every single day. These transactions, as absurd as they sound when we isolate them here on a deep dive, are entirely buried.
Just a drop in the ocean.
Exactly. Criminals use trade-based money laundering precisely to hide these absurdities under mountains of legitimate, incredibly dull paperwork. A bank compliance officer isn't usually looking inside the physical shipping container. They're looking at a spreadsheet of thousands of invoices.
Oh, I see.
If the invoice says 10 tons of decorative items, and the financial value perfectly matches the expected market rate for decorative items, the bank's algorithm might just let it pass without a second thought.
So there is a massive information silo. The customs official physically looking at the frozen food container can't instantly share that bizarre data with the banker who is processing the invoice for a consultancy firm.
They are completely disconnected.
The criminals slip right through the gap between those two isolated systems.
Precisely. And closing that gap requires a major structural shift in how institutions approach intelligence sharing.
So what does this all mean? For you listening to this right now, it means recognizing that environmental crime isn't just a distant ecological tragedy happening in a faraway jungle or a remote ocean.
It's right in our backyard.
It is a highly sophisticated financial crime, and its proceeds are running through the very banks, logistics companies, and trade networks that we all interact with every single day. The exact same systems that power our global economy are being hijacked to tear down our global ecosystem.
It's all connected.
Protecting the planet isn't just about boots-on-the-ground conservation anymore. It requires meticulously following the money.
And for the financial and trade sectors, the ultimate takeaway from this strategic analysis is the urgent necessity for a proactive, risk-based approach. The industry can no longer rely on the era of reactive reporting, simply waiting for adverse media to tell them a crime has occurred.
You need to get ahead of it.
Right. Financial institutions have to actively integrate these specific risk indicators into their automated transaction monitoring systems. If an invoice involves minerals, the system must automatically verify the KPCS documentation.
The diamond passport.
Exactly. If a shipment involves animal products, the system must demand valid CETS permits, which are the international permits required to legally trade wildlife. It requires specialized ongoing training and a robust public-private partnership to permanently close these detection gaps.
It's entirely about calibrating that microscope we talked about earlier. We have to load the right slide so the system can actually see the disease.
Exactly. Which leaves me with a final thought that I haven't been able to shake since reviewing this analysis.
Oh, let's hear it.
Well, we know for a fact that modern retail banks possess the technology to track our daily consumer habits. Our morning coffee purchases, our streaming subscriptions, our travel routes, they track it with terrifying pinpoint accuracy, mostly to sell us targeted financial products or advertisements.
Oh yeah, the algorithms know everything.
Right. So what would happen if they pointed that exact same technological obsession, that same staggering level of AI and transaction data analysis at the complex supply chains of these vague consultancies and general traders?
Wow. If they applied the same AI that knows exactly when and where I buy a latte every Tuesday morning to tracking multi-jurisdictional timber shipments and pool oil exports.
Right. It raises a fascinating question. If fully mobilized and properly calibrated, could the global financial sector, armed with AI and raw transaction data, inadvertently become the most powerful environmental conservationist in the world?
Now that is a thought to leave you with. By fixing the financial blind spot, the banking system might just be the very thing that saves the physical world. Thank you for diving deep with us today. Keep questioning the systems around you, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.